Good morning, everybody. So today we are going to be talking about necessary and sufficient conditions as well as argument. So the idea here is that we're going to get a little bit of background about what arguments are and kind of how they function, because in this class we're going to be talking about we're actually going to be talking a lot about arguments, and you all will be making arguments in your papers. So the big thing here, the big takeaway is going to be how do arguments work and how can we go about critiquing those arguments. And then we're going to be talking about necessary and sufficient conditions as well, which I'll explain. So first and foremost, welcome once again to Phil 100, or Intro to Philosophy. The biggest point here is that you are all already philosophers. You engage in philosophy all the time, even if you don't realize it, right? So you might wonder about whether or not God exists. You might ask a friend what to do in a certain situation, what the right thing to do is. You are engaging with your friend or with others and parent or whatever. You're engaging in philosophy, reason giving, and argument for various philosophical conclusions. And so this is really exciting. So you're already doing the things that we're going to be talking about in this class in our everyday lives. And so that makes you a philosopher. So the goal of this class is to make you better philosophers, make you better at something that you already do. Okay, so first we need to talk about propositions. A proposition is a claim about the way that the world is. So consider some examples of propositions. It is raining in Athens, Tennessee. My name is Spencer Atkins. All cheetahs are cats, and some people enjoy listening to classical music. These are all propositions, insofar as they make some claim about the way that the world is. Now, the question that we can ask is the world the way in which the propositions claim them to be? When we ask that question, we're asking whether or not the claim or the proposition is true or false. So, for example, is it raining in Athens, Tennessee? Well, we might look outside, and if it's raining, then we can conclude that this proposition is in fact true. If you want to know whether or not my name is Spencer Atkins, you ask me my name, and I'll tell you what it is. And assuming that I'm a reliable and trustworthy testifier, I will validate your claim. Okay, good. So these are clearly, or at least plausibly true claims, plausibly true propositions. But some propositions, however, will be false. So the leaves of a tree turn blue in autumn, and all Texans wear cowboy hats. These are claims that are false, mostly because we look outside and the leaves don't turn blue, right? They turn yellow, they turn red, they turn brown, right? All of these other colors, right? And then for the other one, for all Texans wear cowboy hats, all we have to do is go to Texas, find someone that's not wearing a cowboy hat, and we've proposed a counterexample to the proposition all Texans wear cowboy hats. So the takeaway here is that um, with the philosophy that we're going to be doing, we're going to be asking whether or not propositions are true or false. So for this class, we're going to assume bivalence. Bivalence is the claim that propositions are either true or false, right? There's no sort of in between being true or false. Now you might be thinking, that's crazy. Certainly, there's some degree of grayness to some propositions, right? So, for example, am I on the screen or off the screen, right? It's like I'm sort of on the screen, but I'm sort of off the screen. It seems like the claim that I am on the screen is sort of true and also sort of false. In logic, we call these fuzzy or propositions with fuzzy truth value, right? So there's sort of truth and falsity come in degrees according to fuzzy truth values. We're not going to be going there. If you're interested in that, we can talk more about it. But for this class, we're just going to assume that propositions are either true or false. Okay, so what is an argument? So you might be worried about going home for Christmas, and you know that, or maybe Thanksgiving or whatever, and you know that your family members are going to be getting into arguments. Maybe they're going to be yelling at one another, right? This isn't really what we mean by an argument in philosophy. By argument, we mean a set of propositions that lead to a logical conclusion, right? So these propositions stand in some logical relationship with one another, such that a new proposition will be produced that is also true. So some claims or some propositions stand together, right? They have a form together that renders other propositions true on their basis. So, and we're going to be talking about some different argument forms that we'll address in this class. So, for example, consider the following argument. So I have a 1 here. The 1 represents that this is the first premise of the argument. The 2 represents that this is the second premise of the argument. And the C represents that this is the conclusion of the argument, right? So it's not that this is just a list of 3 claims, right? Rather, it's the first premise, and then the second premise, and then a conclusion that's logically deduced by the first 2 premises. So for example, Socrates is a person, okay? Uh, Socrates is a historical philosopher. We're going to be talking a lot about Socrates in the next couple of days. Um, Potentially we will. And we have to ask, well, okay, what is Socrates? Well, okay, Socrates is a person, right? This seems to be true. Okay, premise 2, all people are mortal, right? So we can imagine we get look at all the people in the world. Okay, they're all going to die at some point. Okay, so it seems like they all share a similar feature, namely mortality. Okay, so given the claim that all people are mortal, and given the claim that Socrates is a person, what do we know about Socrates? Well, we know now that he is, in fact, mortal because he is a person, right? So this is an example of an argument. So you see that the first and second premises stand together in a sort of relation such that the conclusion follows from those premises. There's a lot of ink spilt on exactly how the conclusion follows. We're going to ignore that for the purposes of this class, but if you're interested, I would be more than happy to chat about that. Okay, so um, in this class, we're going to be talking a lot about whether or not certain arguments are good arguments, right? So we can run 2 tests for arguments. The true premise test, where we ask, okay, are the premises of the argument true? And then we run the validity test. Does the conclusion follow from the premises? Okay. So when we look at this first argument here, it seems like both of the premises are true. And so it seems to pass the first premise test, or the first test, which is the true premise test. And then it also seems, it strongly seems that the conclusion, in fact, follows from the premises. So it also seems to pass the true, or the validity test as well. Okay, and so when we have a good argument, that argument will both be valid and it will be sound. So, validity, as we've already seen, is that the conclusion follows from the premises. And then soundness is that the premises are true and the conclusion follows from the premises. So, for example, we might have a valid argument that is not sound. So, for example, we could have an argument with false premises, but the conclusion, in fact, follows from the premises. So, for example, Socrates is a horse. All horses are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal, right? Um, that would be technically a valid argument. However, it wouldn't be a sound argument because it has a false premise, namely that Socrates is a horse, right? So this terminology will come up when we're when we're assessing different arguments, we're going to be asking, is this a sound argument? Is this a valid argument? And when you're writing your term papers, you can use these terms in order to more fully capture whether or not an argument is good. Okay, so conditionals. So conditionals are propositions, right? Okay, so we saw that propositions are things like all Texans wear cowboy hats or it is raining outside, right? Claims about what's true about the world. Conditionals are a little bit different. They are propositions, but they have an if-then structure. They have a what's known a conditional structure. So when the first condition is met, then the second one, by necessity, will obtain. So consider the following conditionals. If it is raining outside, then it follows that the sidewalks are wet, right? So it's important to note that this is not an argument, it's a conditional proposition. Um, and then another example is if the food is in the oven too long, then the food will burn, right? Generally speaking, this is true. Maybe if the oven is off, then the food wouldn't burn. But perhaps when the food is in the oven and the oven is turned up to 400 degrees, when the food is too long, well, then the food will burn, right? So so it's important to note that this is a proposition that is subject to truth and false values, right? So we can have a conditional that's false, and we can have a conditional that's true. Um, we don't assess conditionals with um, with the true premise test, or we don't assess conditionals in terms of validity, right? So a little bit of terminology here is the if statement is called the antecedent, and the then statement is called the consequent, right? So I will frequently use these terms when we're talking about arguments, and just so you know that when I say we're going to be looking at there's something wrong with the antecedent, you know that that's the if statement. And finally, conditionals are either true or false. They are not sound, they are not valid, right? They're just true or false. Okay, so let's talk about some argument forms that make use of conditional statements. Okay, so the first here is modus ponens. So the argument form here is if A, then B. A, in fact, obtains, therefore B, in fact, obtains. So the idea here is that the conditional says that A and B stand in a kind of relation to one another, right? So, um, such that if A obtains, B will follow from A. Premise two says that A does in fact obtain, and so it follows that in reality or in fact, B also obtains as well. Um, so um, modus ponens has a fallacious form, right? So suppose premise two were to say B, right? So it's not the case that if A then B, B therefore A. We can't say that, and that's because B can obtain potentially under other conditions as well. This is a problematic form of modus ponens. Okay. Modus tollens has a similar but reverse structure. Modus tollens says that if A obtains, well, then B will also obtain. That's the first premise. Premise two says that it's not the case that B obtains. B is false. Um, Therefore, A does not obtain. That's the idea. So if B doesn't happen, then we know that A doesn't happen as well. And so we'll see throughout the class, we'll see a lot of this argument structure. Okay, finally, we'll be talking about necessary and sufficient conditions. So some of you folks might be thinking about going to professional school, maybe medical school. Okay, so we might wonder, uh, What do you have to do to get into medical school? Okay, so we might say that you need to meet a number of conditions in order to get into medical school, right? So not everybody can. I'm not qualified to go to medical school. If I apply to medical school today, I haven't met all the conditions required for it, right? And so I would be rejected. So we might construe this in philosophy terms as saying that there are a number of necessary conditions for going to medical school, right? Such that if one of these conditions is not met, one cannot get into medical school, right? So, for example, completing and passing organic chemistry is a necessary condition for going to medical school. there are there are no people that go to medical school without first taking organic chemistry. Now, not everybody who takes organic chemistry goes to medical school. So we can say that um, completing organic chemistry is a necessary condition for going to medical school, but it is not a sufficient condition for going to medical school. So you might be wondering, well, what is a sufficient condition? A sufficient condition is a condition that makes something else obtain, right? So if it's raining outside, that is sufficient for the sidewalks being wet, right? So it kind of one condition is there, and it kind of makes it the case that some state of affairs or some state obtains. Okay, so we might say that taking or and passing organic chemistry is a necessary condition for going to medical school, but it is by far not a sufficient condition for going to medical school. If it were a sufficient condition, then that means that everybody that has taken organic chemistry would be in medical school. And that's false. There are some people who are denied access to medical school who have, in fact, passed organic chemistry. So, conditional statements, um, statements with the if then structure, indicate necessary and sufficient conditions. So, the antecedent or the if statement is a sufficient condition for the consequent to obtain. So, if it is raining outside, then the sidewalks are wet. The antecedent, if the if it's raining outside, is sufficient for the sidewalks being wet. Um, by contrast, the consequent or the then statement is a necessary condition for the antecedent to obtain. So we can say, if you are in medical school, then you have taken organic chemistry. Taking organic chemistry is necessary for the antecedent, um, uh, is necessary for being in medical school. So we may wonder, we'll talk a little bit more about this. We may wonder, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for, say, an action to be morally right? What are the necessary and sufficient conditions for, um, say, knowing some proposition? These are the sort of questions that philosophers attempt to answer, and that we're going to try to answer too, or like give proposed answers. And we will frame those answers in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. So, for example, um, a consequentialist will say that an action is morally wrong only if, right, necessary condition, if an action is wrong, then that action brings about a bad outcome, right? So we might say that an action is morally wrong if and only if that action brings about some bad occurrence, right? So we'll be talking about moral theories, how moral theories give answers to the question of what is morally right and what is morally wrong. And those answers will be given in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. Okay, so I've already touched on a lot of this stuff. But this class is going to be primarily focused on arguments, discussing arguments, critiquing arguments, and evaluating arguments. In philosophy, that's our primary method of discourse, right? So in science, there's a rich array of empirical data that we can draw various conclusions from. Philosophy is not really like that. We're not making claims um, necessarily about the way that the world works, right? But we're making claims about what is good, what is valuable, what is beautiful, right? And so, in order to do that, um, we have to take into account we have to use arguments to demonstrate these conclusions, and that's our primary method of discourse. And so we're going to be giving arguments for whether or not God exists, for example, giving arguments for whether or not actions are right or wrong. Say having an abortion is morally right or wrong. We're going to be giving different arguments for different conclusions about the same issue. And then finally, at the end of the class, we'll be wondering, well, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge? Okay, that's going to wrap up for this. If you're feeling scared about arguments and whatever, just email me, come meet me in office hours. We can arrange a meeting with me. We can chat about all this stuff because this stuff is a lot less scary than it seems.